Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Beyond Train podcast. I am your host, Lee Abdal, and I'm so happy that you're here listening to this episode today. If you are new around here, consider subscribing or following the show. If you like what we do here, make sure to comment, subscribe, leave a rating or a review. Sharing is always the best way to help support us. If you would like to support us further, you should consider joining the Beyond Terrain Academy. First and foremost, it is free to join. You do gain access to terrain fundamentals classroom, as well as an introductory course on the true root causes of disease. However, if you do want to go deeper, you can join as a full member to gain access to some exclusive content. Monthly master classes, the Terrain Wellness Club with Jacob Diaz and Alex Zeck, myself, of course. Q&A and discussions, the Terrain Studies Library, deep dive classrooms, things on parasites, lifestyle, movement, etc. You gain access to so much more. A truly unified community, walking along the same path, and some really, really cool discussions. If you pay for the year, you do gain access to a complimentary Catalyst consultation to launch yourself into your terrain-based healing journey, as well as a year-end check-in. Regardless, you should go and join the community because it is free to join and there are tons of free resources. But without further ado, let's get into today's episode.
Welcome back, Mr. Goldsworthy, to the podcast. Thank you for your time.
Well, it's great to be back.
Of course.
It's good to chat about
been too
health.
long.
Yeah, I don't know how long it's been, but it's great to be back.
Wonderful. Amazing. We're going to do a number on chronic disease today, maybe sidebar into a few little more specific topics. Where do we start this conversation?
Yeah, you do a lot of podcasts on different parts of terrain, the terrain paradigm, and it's kind of moved past germs now, I think, into kind of everything really. Genetics, autoimmunity, the fallacy of autoimmunity, and other areas. And I think we need to tick a lot of boxes in the terrain paradigm. Mm-hmm. There is a general belief that the body can do it all itself. And I think that's by and large pretty true. But I think, and I might be one of the only ones that think this in the paradigm, but I think there are some exceptions that the body has kind of, once certain parts of the body, particularly the nervous system, is affected by something in the environment, sometimes it's hard for it to rectify itself. And I do believe that it tries to do it. And we can discuss how it does that and what those symptoms look like. I definitely think that's true. But it's very clear that it doesn't always achieve it. And that a lot of these autoimmune conditions are examples of actual nervous system dysfunction, not endocrine. We can start there. I think, you chatted about people are really interested about Hashimoto's disease or thyroid disease, any kind of autoimmune, any kind of thyroid disease, really. And one of the interesting about thyroid is that, from my perspective, what you got to do is you got to follow what part of the body keeps it alive. Of course, blood supply, but what it keeps it alive at an electrical level is the nervous system. And interesting thing about it is that the vagus nerve, my area of expertise, which, I do a lot of reading up on a day-to-day basis, and I found a paper showing, that, the thyroid gland is innervating or connecting the brain to the thyroid, which basically means you could say it's where our electrical system meets the endocrine system in that regard. But a lot of people see it as a pituitary downstream system. So pituitary connecting to thyroid. Hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis is the one you'll hear a lot about, right? And there are other axes we can go into, but that one's often not talked about. And people take hormones to help with it, or they might take other supplements. But one of the things that I think people are not aware of is that there's some good evidence to suggest that thyroid can decline. This is not the only reason, but the thyroid gland can decline its function when the nerve innervating it declines in its function, which is a concept not generally talked about. So the way to look at it is if the nerve that goes to that gland is in some ways affected by loss of voltage or compression syndrome or something else, then it may negatively affect its function. Hence why people can get low thyroid function. That's an example. And also why the thyroid might decline in its structure, and hence why the body has this sort of, what we thought was an attack on the thyroid, actually probably more likely to be repair enzymes. Those same auto antibodies are more likely to be repair based, or at least debris removal systems. Probably most people agree in terrain that's the case. But if we try to inhibit those things, all we're doing is suppressing the healing of the thyroid. So, but I think one extra thing to that is we need to start looking at the local nerves. And, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that red light therapy, infrared, near-infrared light applied to the thyroid and surrounding tissues is very effective at improving the function of the thyroid.
Sure.
And that is very much the case in my experience. There's also evidence to suggest that electrical stimulation of the local vagal nerves there, the smaller nerves that run from the main branch, when you electrically stimulate it, you can improve thyroid function quite dramatically. So that proves the point that we need to start to look at gland-based problems, adrenals, even ovaries and things like that, as being often a neurological origin, not just chemical. And then it goes down the whole idea of what really is hormonal imbalance. Is it an appropriate imbalance that has some function that we're just not fully aware of? Therefore, it's possibly if you do something to rectify this so-called imbalance, then are you going against the body's wishes and therefore reducing your healing capacity or something else? But also, if the body is unable to produce a said hormone, in this case it would be T4, which gets converted, then we would need to deal with the reason. And I think this is where maybe some people might disagree, but I think we need to start to implement something that will be productive as far as healing of the nerve or improving its voltage. Voltage is a difficult subject for a lot of people. It goes into a bit of physics. But basically, nerves need conduction or conductibility. And I use a lot of the structured water principles of negative charge. And if it doesn't have that negative charge and ability to conduct electricity, then you're going to have real problems downstream into wherever it innervates or goes to and supplies energy to. And I think that things that damage that voltage, we don't fully understand that yet. There's likely that the environment, whether it's electromagnetics or something else, certainly it seems pesticides have some role to play. Maybe plastics, maybe other heavy metals, more than likely. It seems certain nerves have they're far more likely to be affected by this than others. And that does actually make sense because they're more, they're in contact with the environment more. Like the vagus nerve is in the back of the throat. It's inside the inner ear. It's in your respiratory tract and your gastrointestinal system. It's in contact with the outside world. So is some of the other nerves that are affected. You've heard of Bell's palsy, where half the face loses function. Well, that's by and large, it's going to be the facial nerve, and that's on the tongue as well. So it's a taste receptor nerve. And trigeminal nerve, which is involved in headaches, which is really common with toxicity. And eye problems as well can be associated with this nerve. And that nerve is in the whole inside of the mouth and the nasal cavities and things like that. And these nerves are particularly affected by the environment. It's quite notable. If you look at people who have toxicity, you'll probably find that a lot of these nerves are the nerves that are acting up. It may be appropriate, as in vomiting is appropriate, and that's the vagus nerve. But the symptoms of it are often these nerves because they're the first contact. But yeah, we need to start having new conversations about these affected different tissues of the body that are not necessarily discussed as nervous system related. Yeah.
Absolutely. So if we take a step back, and I know you kind of touched on it a little bit, and that was a great example to start us off, when it comes to the nervous system, like, are we talking about pure, you mentioned, there's the maybe the chemical side of things, maybe a deficiency side of things, if there's a deficiency in maybe fats in the diet, or whatever it may be, is it a purely electrical thing, or the EMFs really something that's disrupting this, and what, I'm kind of curious about the development of the problems that come with maybe nervous system issues, right? Like, it doesn't just start as thyroid issues or adrenal
No,
issues, right? Like, it
no.
kind of begins a little bit more subtly than that.
Well, they used to say, and how true this is debatable. When I used to work in functional medicine, we don't like that term anymore. But functional medicine basically said that Hashimoto's thyroid disease started like 10 to 15 years before the first symptom. I don't know how they derived that idea, but I mean, that makes sense. It makes sense that it would take a long time to develop something but the true question is really, is the reason the same that they thought? No, they never talk about the nervous system. It's always chemical. And that's one of the biggest problems, I think, is that everyone, when they discuss anything to do with all of these conditions, they think chemical. But we have to move past that. So coming back to fats and nutrients, fats are often a big player when it comes to people who've had dietary problems for a long period of time, like long term. This is going to ruffle some feathers, but I have real problem. I have actually potentially there is potential problems with fasting. One of the things I've noticed is that people's vagal health, or their general health in their vagus nerve, measured by heart rate on average, heart rate variability, breath rate, gastrointestinal stability, tolerance to foods, allergies or not. That's a vagal health thing. So people can be overreactive to food, and it's actually often either one or two things with that. I'm going to just mention this so it makes sense. Either that the vagus nerve is hyperactive and it overreacts. This can be appropriate, but it becomes increase in activity and they vomit. And then another type is where they don't produce enough enzymes, so the body can't really digest it, so it excretes it, and they get this kind of intolerance to food in that way. A lot of the body can't absorb food if you don't stimulate these processes. And so, like, for example, regular eating actually stimulates vagal function. It's logical. It's like flexing, it's like strengthening a muscle. If you don't eat, you suppress function. And that is my belief. At this point in my work with the vagus nerve, people do way better with regular eating than they do with fasting. And I think there's a fallacy with fasting that you actually feeling better is being better. You got to be careful. Like we talked about, a lot of people miss this point. Just because you feel good doesn't mean you're healthy. And I think that I'll give you an example. If you're sick and you're vomiting up things, and okay, you've had something that's toxic, but the fact that you're vomiting it up and getting rid of it is a health sign. You're healthy enough to recognize the toxin and excrete it. I would classify that as a healthy response, right? Sure. Having a flu, or how they say you're less, we'll just use the medical terms for a moment, you're less likely to get chronic disease if you had, as a child, you had the communicable diseases like measles, things like that, right? I'm sure you've heard this before. That evidence is pretty good. Now, I'm not saying I don't believe in the measles virus, but and I don't necessarily believe in what these conditions are purported to be. But my point is that it's likely that these so-called infectious diseases, you've mentioned it millions of times, this sort of detox process is more active in these people, at least at that moment, and that has some beneficial long-term effects. Whereas if you suppress it, then you're more likely to get said chronic diseases because you didn't get rid of problems early through those normal mechanisms. Now, I think when we find someone is feeling really good as a measurement of one of our interventions, say, for example, fasting, it doesn't necessarily mean that. And a lot of people who are anorexic, I know it's an extreme version, feel incredible, but they are not well, And I think we just need to be careful. So I definitely think that a lot of people with vagus nerve problems respond very, very well to consistent, regular meals, because there's this sort of issue with when you eat, right? You lower your cortisol. You probably understand that very well, right? And that is because partly, not only because of a chemical reason, but also because of a neurological reason, and it's because our nervous system flips into parasympathetic mode. And it needs to digest the food. But every time it does that, it stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system. What's it going to do if it never stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system, or it does it at a lower level? That's my argument. And anecdotally, I've seen it work better. And you hear that, that's why diets are so confusing for some people. Some people are like, oh, you got to have 8 meals a day, like 8 small meals and you'll feel better. And the other person's like, going to eat once a day, time restricted eating, I'm more from personal experience, and it's like they say, well, if you do intermittent fasting, you can cure cancer. And I'm like, well, is curing cancer curing the why, or is it just suppressing some innate thing that the body's trying to do through the process of whatever cancer is? So that's the big question with that.
I think just to highlight a little point. No, just to highlight a point, because you often hear the stories of, oh, I went and I fasted for 30, 60, 90 days and, I cured myself of cancer, right? You read, Herbert Shelton, and, you listen to a lot of the New Age folks now. I fasted all my problems away. You often hear about that short-term feeling better. And what you generally don't hear about, and this is true when it comes to pretty much any supplementation, because the marketing companies obviously want you to know a certain narrative.
Yeah.
You don't hear about 10, 20 years down the road how life is, even a year down the road. When symptoms reoccur, when it comes to parasite cleanse, is something I'm talking a lot about lately. You hear about the benefits after the cleanse, but you don't hear about the 4-5 times a year that symptoms just come back and you have to do the cleanse again.
I hope that you guys are enjoying the episode so far, and if you are, you will love the Beyond Terrain Academy. I've taken everything that I've learned from studying the terrain, speaking with the greatest minds in the terrain field, and have distilled it down to the fundamentals, easily digestible content and material, as well as a place to go even deeper and more specific into the terrain as well. Becoming a full Academy member gives you access to monthly masterclasses, the Terrain Wellness Club, the Terrain Studies Library, Q&A and discussions, as well as deep dive classrooms in things like parasites, movement, terrain lifestyle factors, as well as a space for reflection. There is so much available in the Beyond Terrain Academy. And don't forget, you can pay for the entire year to gain access to that Catalyst consultation to launch you into your healing journey, as well as a year in check-in to ensure that you've been putting into practice the terrain principles to keep you accountable. But let's get back to the episode.
Yep. And it's not that different to, hey, like I had the flu, I had this like inflammation, I took a corticosteroid and I felt incredible. I kept taking the corticosteroid and I ended up with cancer. Like that's what happens. Like I think we need to be careful, and it's a delicate conversation, cancer. I understand that, and I don't love going into it too much, but and it's not my area of expertise. I'm definitely not going in that vein. I'm just saying that we need to be careful when we're looking at things differently, that we don't fall into the same traps that you did in germ theory, right? And it's the same thing. But the body, we forget that the body's innately intelligent. Oh, but if in this situation it's not, okay. And I think that's what we've got to be careful of. And I'm not saying everyone who does nothing is going to get well. I don't mean that either. I'm just saying that we need to see where we're actually helping the body or where we're suppressing the body. And I think sometimes a therapy appears to be working with the body, and they'll say stuff like mitochondrial regeneration or mitochondrial, like also it's always a mitochondria, right? So it's the way out for the people with fasting, and it's always mitochondria. But I think going into some of the stories of people coming out of concentration camps, a lot of them didn't want to start eating again to the same degree they used to. So there's got to be a reason for that. They didn't all feel bad. A lot of them felt that. Got to be careful again. But anything to do with where people are really starving, sometimes they go into a different mode and it can feel pretty incredible. But that doesn't mean it's good. That's what I'm saying. With some exceptions. But coming back to like chronic disease, like it's very clear that people need to eat properly. Like these are the low-hanging fruits. I don't say to people when they come into my clinic, I don't say, hey, look, you're smoking this many a day, you're drinking. These things need to change, right? You can't fix a vagus nerve if that person's, having like 3 wines a night. They're not going to get better. It's just plain simple. And it doesn't matter how good I am as a clinician. I can't fix that problem. Only they can. It's the same for tobacco smoking and all of that. Alcohol is definitely worse when it comes to the vagus nerve. But these are easy outs. They just need to stop. But then it comes to food. I don't think there's necessarily one way. I'm definitely not a big. I don't particularly believe in veganism, but I definitely think that some people don't do well on just carnivore either. You need to get a good balance and listen to your body, and that's not always easy to do. Maybe more like your ancestors of your particular part of the world that you're from, as much as you can within reason. Unless imagine if you're 50% from Europe, 50% from Asia. I don't know how that works, but I know that I'm European, so I tend to eat European foods and do better for it. That's my experience. But then it comes to actually, what do we do about these things? Like people come in, they have really serious problems, rheumatoid arthritis or whatever that really is, osteoarthritis to a lesser extent with pain, lupus or whatever that is, Sjogren's, which is more to do with production of tears and saliva and other joint fluids and things like that. It's likely that these are toxicity problems. I don't think they're emotional, personally. I think the emotional side of things aggravates it, makes it more pronounced, because excessive trauma and emotions can really dismantle how your body deals with toxicity. I think that's partly the problem. And there's some of these people that they're an enigma. The why is not easy to find. It's not easy to find. But the main thing you need to be able to do with these people, with anyone with chronic disease, is not necessarily know why, because that may not help you with treating them. It's what do we do now? And most of all, it's actually, for a lot of these people, it's actually promoting inflammation. It's promoting inflammation. I know that sounds really scary for some people, but I don't mean eating things that are toxic, therefore you have more inflammation. I mean things that support your body's ability to produce an inflammatory response and adequate inflammatory response in all it encompasses. That includes removing the debris of tissues that have declined. That means promoting blood flow, which is a key part of inflammation. It also means removing toxins. So there are 3 parts of inflammation, right? Removal of the debris that's accumulated from tissues declining, either from trauma or from degeneration. And then you're going to have to go in there and remove any toxins as well, because that suppresses healing. And then healing, of course. But a lot of people don't realize that that has to happen. A lot of in Chinese medicine they do. It seems Chinese medicine figure that out. They talk about it in sort of different words. And we acupuncturists and me, Chinese medicine clinicians and me, think very much alike, except I have a Western lens. There's got to be something about that, you know. And interestingly, they do seem to understand the vagus nerve in Chinese medicine because they've done ear acupuncture where a lot of our stimulation's done. But coming back to like, how do we deal with disease? It's not necessarily a fad diet. It's not necessarily going to be you do exercise, you get light, you get diet, you get breathing exercise, and you're going to heal. It's not necessarily going to do that. Most patients that come in have done all the right things. You know, they're not all coming in alcoholic or, you know, junk food addicts or, you know, just all the things you would expect from chronic disease cases. No, they're doing better than I am. You know, they're far more diligent with all these practices, and yet they're still here, you know. And that means, well, what else is there? And I think in the terrain field, we need to start having those answers, you know.
Yeah, you know, and I've been talking to a lot of people lately, and it's reported as this feeling of being stuck.
Yeah.
You know, people are stuck, and they're like, yeah, I've done carnivore, I've done vegan, I've done raw carnivore, I've done, you know, everything you can imagine to go down the list, and they're stuck. And then it's like, oh, well, the question is then, you know, I'm like, you know, part of me is like, well, what is it? What is it? But I love the question of what do we do now? I think that's really interesting. You know, so getting past this stuckness.
Well, I think one of the key ones is understanding the condition differently. Okay, so key one is let's talk about pain for a moment, right? That's a big one. So people come in, they say, oh, I had this really bad pain. It hasn't gone away. My scan shows this, or my scan, you know, my doctor says I need surgery or I need, you know, and they often are like doing all sorts of lifestyle changes. Still, they're stuck. And nearly every single time a case like that comes up, they've been misinformed. Most, and I've said this in another one of our podcasts, is that most conditions that have been reported on as being the cause of their pain statistically are unlikely to be the cause of their pain. They're likely to be associated mildly higher in people with pain, but by association doesn't mean causation. You know, osteoarthritic joints are as likely in a pain-free individual as in a person in pain. You know, knee osteoarthritis, hip, whatever. People think that they are directly associated, but they're not. And then the question is, well, then why? And that's why I always tend to go to nerves, because it's our easiest portal into the pain system.
Sure.
Easiest way to kind of contact and talk to the nervous system in some way. And it does actually work in the same way for other diseases. Like, that's why I say thyroid, like applying light, applying other nerve-based therapies, we call neuromodulation, nerve altering therapies. There's lots of them out there. Vibration, even just vibration has been shown to improve nerve conduction. You know, like those vibration massages that have high pulses can do that when applied correctly. Light therapy, of course, electrostimulation. Some types of magnets seem to do it, and possibly other topical approaches, but that's sketchy at the moment. But these are the things that need to be discussed, and each case is difficult. You know, like when it comes to say like something like chronic fatigue, you know, people get told it's their mitochondria all the time. And they spend the whole of their working time with clinicians, naturopaths, whatever it might be, doctors, trying to get energy, trying to promote energy. Whereas from my perspective, they're stuck in a healing state. And it might be appropriate, but if you focus constantly on trying to get energy, I don't think you'll ever fix it. I don't think you'll ever fix chronic fatigue. It's a wrong idea, I think. It's probably more likely something that we just don't fully understand. I've had some really strange improvements in chronic fatigue by just improving blood flow systemically through things like shockwave and other therapies that promote blood flow. All my therapies are pro-inflammatory. Don't tell anyone. It's a good thing. Like needling, like acupuncture is pro-inflammatory. There's no way putting a needle into someone And you can't say that's anti-inflammatory when you insert a stainless steel object into someone. That is it is inducing an inflammatory response immediately. And it's deliberate. It's meant to. And that's a good thing about it, right? And all of these things do that. Light therapy actually is pro-inflammatory. It's a net anti-inflammatory effect. So people need to start considering these things and improving their blood flow. I think we keep going back to improving blood flow. A lot of people actually don't have good blood flow. And maybe that's because it appears that blood flow is in some ways electromagnetic, right? There's the work of Pollock suggests that blood flow is at least guided in some ways by infrared light or improved by infrared light. So that's more outdoor exposure. But there's more to it that we just don't understand. A lot of people are coming in here, and I mentioned to you we should discuss this clinical entity called POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, often put under the banner of dysautonomia, dysfunction in the autonomic nervous system. Well, this term POTS is often misdiagnosed. Firstly, half the people come in here with the term POTS. Oh, I've been diagnosed, officially diagnosed. And they have low blood pressure. There's not POTS. That's a different condition. And what POTS basically is this. When you lie down, your heart generally will come down to a relatively lower level than normal, than upon standing. Then you stand up. If your heart rate excessively goes like past 30 beats per minute and your blood pressure raises in some way, has to raise, then you've got POTS, clinical diagnostic criteria. Now, obviously, I use that term because I deal with medicos, right? So I understand. But even the medicos get it wrong because they miss the blood pressure. The blood pressure drops and the heart rate goes up. But actually, this symptom is a symptom of dehydration. And I knew this from a long time ago, and a lot of people improve with just taking salt and water. Don't need to do vagus nerve stimulation, particularly the ones that had low blood pressure, which is not really POTS at all. They would get better by drinking more water and having more salt. And all of a sudden, the doctors are doing it too. So obviously, some of the patients out there that were doing this protocol told their doctors, and they're like, it's a great protocol, and they started doing it. It's an easy one to do. So a lot of these POTS cases don't need intervention. They just need to do better hydration and better salt intake. But there's another issue with a lot of these things is that, and I'm still trying to get my head around it. This is getting into the nitty gritty of the why. Remember we talked about these people come in, they've done everything. We need an answer. And this is what I'm trying to come up with when it comes to something like POTS as an example, because it's one of my specialities, you could say, as POTS appears to be particularly affected by the vagus nerve. Heart rate is suppressed by the vagus nerve. And in these people, their heart rate's through the roof, often in the 100 to 120 in standing, just moving around the house. Some people have really bad POTS, and it's like the heart rate's 160 all the time. And they lie down, and it comes back down to normal. And stand up, and it goes up to 160 again. This is essentially a bad case of POTS, whatever you want to call it. And many of them, it appears, have something structurally going on. And not all of them have the reasons why you might think, right? What I've noticed is that if we reposition their upper cervical joints, often the C2, the C1, you actually push it forward or slightly angled forward. There's some angles that are better. Their heart rate immediately drops on standing. They're standing up, the heart rate's through the roof. You apply a pressure, heart rate drops. Now, that's no coincidence. Now, the reason that may well be, and this is hypothetical because we don't know, is that these upper cervical segments are very, very close and have influence on the brainstem. When you push them forward, you push the brainstem forward a little bit. And there are clinical entities where the brainstem appears to be being squashed in some way by structures like part of the cerebellum, which is a lower part of the brain, in a condition that I think it's actually way more common. It's called Chiari malformation. and it's diagnosed in a way of which almost no one can achieve, which is an upright brain MRI. So the MRI has to be for standing. And in Australia, there's only one in Sydney. So no one's getting diagnosed properly. If you do, like, you could go and get a brain MRI to rule it out, but it's not the test you use to rule it in. And so a lot of people come in, and that procedure, which appears to be affecting their upper cervical, spinal cord and brainstem, not really their vagus nerve, even though the vagus nerve comes from the brainstem, it comes into the front of the neck. It affects it at a much higher level. And why? Why is this happening? It can't be environmental. Surely not. It's structural. Repositioning of the C1, C2 forward doesn't really fit in our model, terrain model. So have all these people had car accidents? No. Have some of them had like forceps birth? Not many. One I've seen in the last few weeks, but it's not common. Suction, no. Is it cesarean? No, that wouldn't make any difference anyway. I don't know. And not all of them are hypermobile or unstable in their body. Like, a lot of people think that the upper neck is affected by hypermobility in my field. And they're really common cases. You'll see a lot of people come in with vagus nerve problems. They're often digestive issues, heart, breathing. They're all affected by the vagus nerve. Then they often have hypermobility, meaning they're hyperflexible, particularly hyperflexible, more than you would ever think. It's more than just being able to touch your toes. So it's your head to your knees, your elbows hyperextend, your knees hyperextend, your ear touches your shoulder, like proper hypermobility. And they're not the only ones with these upper neck problem. I still haven't figured it out. Why are all these people getting it? I don't think it's new. I think it's just we've finally figured out that in some ways affects heart rate. But one of the big problems is now with POTS is that it's over medicalized, because a lot of people are being told that their symptoms are from POTS. I know I'm going down another rabbit hole here, but this is like a lot of other conditions. If you are told this is the reason you have your symptoms, then the search is over. That is not a good way to go about things, I had a patient that was told her stomach bloating and gut issues were from POTS. Now, of course, that's already incorrect, because POTS symptoms don't include gut. And if it does include gut, that's associative. And, okay, the vagus nerve is involved in both, but that's not what they were told. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people have headaches standing, and they get told it's from POTS. And I think we've got to be very careful. What I'm basically saying is that we need to look at ways, like, why are these new ideas, like, say, repositioning of a vertebrae affecting the brainstem and things like that? Why are these things real things? What is really going on here? And I ask the terrain community to keep an open mind, that if we fall into the trap of there is no abnormality in what the body does, it's all innately intelligent, I think the body has Achilles' heels that it falls prey to, and then it can't get out of. I don't necessarily think cancer is that, personally, as an example. I think the body can self-rectify whatever the reason that cancer has to occur. When it comes to something like this, people can be stuck in these chronic states forever, it seems, and don't really have a way out, no matter how many good things they do. There is no end to this conversation, so I'll just say, what else?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I guess my thoughts on it, because we've been talking about this quite a bit in the academy. I think if I'm getting really philosophical with kind of the terrain paradigm, with the philosophy of the terrain, I would take it outside of just the body. I would take the holism outside of just the individual, and I would look at the holism of, kind of our realm. And I guess my explanation out of this, because I found it to be logically consistent, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, is that when we are in these chronic states and things aren't necessarily getting better, I do think that there's been a structural change. When you think of home toxicology, there's been cellular division, they call it, right? Something in the body changes structure, alters function, and it's not just going to necessarily flick back randomly, right? But it's almost like conservation, right? So conserve the body as long as you can. Maybe it's a storage of toxicity or trying to conserve a certain function of the body. We could go into examples, but I think that would be the point that I would take. And, just because the body tends towards death, sometimes death is the bioremediation pathway of the body. Sometimes, and that's kind of looking at holism as a greater thing. Just because you tend towards death, right? That's the body saying, well, listen, you're burdened with toxicity, you have structural damage, you have, incurable illness, it's time to just go back to the earth and let's start anew. And that's kind of an uncomfortable part of philosophy.
It's true. It's absolutely true. I mean, I think you're right. There's definitely examples of that. Like we touched on posture last time, controversially. Posture is almost certainly unrelated to pain. And although there are always exceptions to the rule, the evidence doesn't back up that pain is associated with poor posture. And the so-called poor posture or bad alignment or bad this is just it's a construct. Most postures are adaptive for the body to try to achieve a goal, right? A head forward posture generally has it's actually a slight lowering of neural tension in the body. The more upright you are like this, and the more spinal cord tension you have. When you're forward positioned, you actually take the spinal cord tension off. And so if someone has some kind of neurological compression or impingement, and they stay like that in this more upright, perfect posture, it can actually be quite detrimental to movement. People don't want to hear that because they've been told either proper technique, so-called perfect technique at the gym, or so-called proper posture and people bank on that. There's whole industries around posture and correcting posture. It's a money-making thing because everyone has some kind of postural abnormality. So I will be brutal here, I think most of it is just money-making. So someone comes in and you've got some kind of way of assessing posture. It might be using video. It might be using some kind of scanner. There's lots of different devices out there that you do something with posture. And they use a plumb line. They say, look, you've got this, and this means this. Mostly just not based on truth. It's just they've extrapolated. And then they'll say, well, here's how we're going to fix it. And that there is no evidence that fixing that posture will fix their problem. They might feel better fixing their posture, but it goes back to the same question: shouldn't we deal with the why, not the posture? The posture is very much downstream, and a lot of people with really bad posture have no symptoms. A lot of people with perfect posture have a lot of symptoms. It's not. Sure. And the evidence backs that up with the research that's done on posture versus poor versus bad posture. They can't correlate them very well. So my point is that deal with the why. And look, a lot of people are weak, purely weak. They've got weak muscles because they're sedentary. Simple. It's not hard to understand. And so therefore, their posture adapts to be more stable. So your joints aren't inherently in a stable position when they're in good posture. They're actually far more open and they're in so-called good alignment, but they're actually there for increased motion. So when you have less stability because you're weak, you need to find stability in the body elsewhere through different positions of the joints. So the main thing is to get strong. The main thing is to maintain your mobility. And that's how a lot of posture gets better. It's not because of something very specific. So it kind of aligns with what you're saying. You know, we need to deal with why the body is adapting, and and realize that it's not always a bad thing. Not always a bad thing. These so-called adapted processes, and it can actually have a good payoff long term. It sounds a bit vague, but it does depend on the situation. I think nearly every time, as a rule, adaptive positions and adaptive things that the body have done can have rectifying effects. Sometimes it can be healing and reversing of conditions. But you know, a lot of people don't get to that point. They can't deal with symptoms. Like a lot of people in pain can't deal with the kind of pain that they could experience in the healing process. You know, like if you sprain your ankle, you expect to have pain and you kind of go through it. You don't tend to take a lot of painkillers because you know what's going on, right? You know you're healing. But when you've got something of another kind of pain, you don't think that's right? And so the body must be something wrong. I've got to fix it. The pain, a lot of the pain chemicals are the same chemicals that make blood flow increase. Prostaglandins are blood flow enhancers. Thromboxanes, leukotrienes, they're all pain-producing chemicals. Bradykinin, these are all promoting blood flow as well. So a lot of it comes down to that. I digress, as usual.
You're good. Something that pops in my mind is this concept of maladaptation. This is something that I was taught.
Maladaptation, yeah.
Yeah, I was taught this term.
Like chronic inflammation.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
But I was taught this term actually in the psychological world when I studied like EMDR and different trauma healing modalities. And I think there's a case that can be made about maladaptive habits, right? But it is quite a subjective thing. What's adaptive for one person and maladaptive for another? It's also contextual. When you're in the initial situation, when you adapt to it and you develop a certain habit, say for, every time you see a certain person walk in the room, you run to the bedroom because you're going to get hit or something like that, like that's an adaptive. And then eventually, you see that person when you're 50 years old and, they're 70 and old and you have the same response. Maybe they consider it maladaptive, right? And it's kind of contextual and subjective, and we're kind of tiptoeing into a different conversation in the psychological world. But it's something that's really interested me, this concept of maladaptation, even kind of in the physical body. And I think it alludes to this sort of structural change that we're talking about. And I think when I think of structural, I think, maybe physical structure, has something to do with that. But I think even if you go down to the structure of the water in your cells, for lack of better terms, or the structure of, these kind of ultra structures, I think there's a lot of problems with cell biology.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it certainly seems like there are ultra structures, right? There are smaller components to our bodies, and maybe there are structural changes here, and maybe we can take it down to the water level, take it down to, even, I'm kind of tying in a lot of concepts here, but even something like the biogeometry or bioenergetics, the minerals and elements of the world forming this energetic lattice for, the water to structure around. Because it's clear that, even though we're mostly water, a kidney is a kidney, a liver is a liver, and they're made out of largely the same things, but they have sort of this different crystalline structural configuration, right? And then perhaps alteration of that structure may be due to some sort of energetic properties, maybe due to the introduction of the wrong elements, like too many heavy metals and not enough minerals or something like that,
Yeah.
And I think, is this like a maladaptive concept? Like, should we start talking about this maladaptive concept in the physical world? Like, and then that's when I think tying in this whole concept of chronic disease, like, are we just maladapting to our environment? Like, did we adapt for a reason and then we're just stuck here and we're like stuck? And you mentioned something really interesting earlier. It was like increasing the energy in the system isn't necessarily going to combat lack of motivation or fatigue or lack of vitality or joie de vivre or whatever it is. Because if you have a circuit that's hooked up incorrectly, you can increase the energy in that circuit. It's just not going to do anything.
No, and for example, the vegetative state is a vagal state, right? And that's appropriate, right? So it's appropriate for winding down and going to sleep. It's appropriate for after eating to sort of not raise your adrenaline so that you can adequately digest your food. People can be stuck in this state, this vegetative state. And stuck, I use that term not because I necessarily think it's dysfunctional or maladaptive, right?
Sure.
But because we don't understand why. We don't understand why they're stuck in that vegetative parasympathetic state. See, being in the parasympathetic state at a high level is tiring. It's a very tired feeling. People think it's like peace. I'm like, you don't get it. Parasympathetic is like death at extremes. Do you know about the people who they thought were dead, but their heart rate was like, 15 beats per minute? And they put them in a coffin or they put them in the morgue and they wake up. They're in an extreme parasympathetic state. And you even saw it where people died due to intubation, where the intubation was put down the throat and it's overstimulated the vagus nerve and their heart sank to almost like no beats at all. They revive them sometimes with like adrenergic drugs, things like that. So parasympathetic, it's not always cracked up to be. And some of the worst cases I have are in a hypervagal state, whatever that means. But you understand that it means increased, excessive, a lot of parasympathetic tone. And it doesn't mean it's always a good thing. And that's that binary like of parasympathetic, good, sympathetic, bad. Definitely that conversation needs to go. Because that is not a survival system. That is a roll over and die system. That's what that is. You need both systems active, and it's often better to have a very healthy sympathetic response because it's a higher survival rate. You talk about that person ran into the room. It was excessive response, but hey, they're more likely to survive than the person that doesn't, right? That classic evolution of our nervous system. But I think you were alluding to the fact that is it, and I've lost my train of thought about as to what you originally said, but are we dealing with something at a more meta level, right? Coming back to that, I mean, will we ever know? Are we as human beings able to conceptually understand what really goes on in the body? It's a little bit like the movie The Matrix, right? How did they create the Matrix? What is exactly that program that creates that illusion that things are real? I'm not saying we're a program, but I'm saying things can be at a level that's so incomprehensible that our tiny little brains are never going to understand it. We think very Newtonianly, we think very linear, and I battle with clinicians to think more beyond too much estrogen or too much X or too much Y or too little X. That way of thinking for me is the most, redundant way of thinking about the body. We are thinking at a higher level still than that. We're trying to take it up a level, like broader, like not always about the symptom, the hormone, and the neurotransmitter, if they exist at all, and something else. That's it. But see, the problem is, in my world, that's all that people talk about, and so right now, what we're talking about is like meta terrain, above this, above, and it's great to have that conversation. But I think that God, these people are so stuck in this is in the natural medicine world. They are so stuck in Chronic inflammation, bad. Cytokines, bad. Excessive estrogen is pro-inflammatory, causes endometriosis. I mean, it's so wrong that I don't know how they are not prepared to think at a higher level than that. Mm-hmm. When they do, they go, "Oh, well, it's diet and gluten," or it's the diet, and then it's not enough things that support microbiome diversity. The word comes out. And again, they're stuck in the same loop. It's this constant loop. I think we mentioned this because people will relate. Even within the freedom community here and the terrain community, people still say, "Oh, I'm going to do a parasite cleanse." I'm like, do you understand that parasite cleanse contradicts terrain? It completely contradicts terrain. Oh, but I'm going to do a mold cleanse. It contradicts. And I think that's a bigger issue at the moment. We will get to the why. We'll probably get to the why one day, maybe not in my lifetime. And it's probably going to be some kind of either particle physics or something else that I just don't comprehend. It might be God. But a lot of it isn't really disease. This is the thing. A lot of disease is not disease. It's just the body curing itself, and we get in the way. It's a classic conversation in terrain. And when is it not that? Well, I think those questions are not fully answerable yet. We don't know why. I had those examples of correcting alignment, made the heart rate come down. I'm not doing anything that's suppressive. The sympathetic nervous system is not crushed by me pushing the C1, C2 forward. So, right, caveat to that is maybe the C2 and C1 are meant to be back. And when I push them forward, I crush the sympathetic nerves that go to the heart. But I don't do that. That's not what's happening there. So I'm aware of the other storyline. And so you always have to ask both questions. Am I assisting the system? This goes to clinicians out there and people. Am I assisting my system by doing what I'm doing? Or am I suppressing my system that makes me feel better but doesn't help my system? Or am I doing something that is proposed to do something that it probably doesn't? Like, for example, many parasite cleanses do work in the right way, but because they're using things that are detoxing heavy metals. And so they're doing something else, but they think that it's to do with parasites. And so I think sometimes it's that as well. It's actually that the therapy is doing the right thing, but the reasons why are not what you think. And I definitely don't think toxins are needed. I think if we weren't mining metals, we would never have toxicity of metals, I think if we didn't make plastics, we wouldn't have microplastic toxicity. There's clear evidence that that's not a problem. If we didn't have such soil degradation, we would have probably much higher levels of minerals in our food. Mm-hmm. But it's absolutely the case that our soils are completely degraded, with some exceptions. And I'm not sure, is supplementing the way out of it? I don't know. I'm still up in the air about that. I'm sure you are too. I'm not sure.
I would love a little bit of a clarification on kind of the concept of alignment versus posture.
So there's chiropractic ideology in this. So chiropractic belief systems is basically you can have what's called a malposition, or they call it subluxation in traditional chiropractic. Malposition, again, malposition, abnormal position, meaning in the case of vertebrae, that one or a few are rotated when you're in standing static. They might be flexed forward, they might be flexed back, extended, laterally flexed, sliding forward or back. They're called listheses. Are these inappropriate or appropriate? That's very much another debate, right? If I relieve pain am I, okay, this is it's very philosophical. If I relieve someone's pain, am I suppressing healing?
Mm-hmm.
Because pain is associated with the same chemicals that increase blood flow. All of them, pretty much. All of them. Like that's why I'm like, you got to ask that question. But that's what alignment means as far as chiropractic. Alignment, there is other types of alignment that is discussed. Pelvic alignment. So like the inanimate bones, your hip bones, these big two ear-shaped things, they can twist, they can do like all sorts of little actions. Are those problematic? Well, I'll give you examples of when they appear to be related to their problem or are just kind of there. So some people, when you reposition that bone and they move around, they feel better. So other than that, I don't know, like a lot of them are out of alignment all the time and it's not a problem. So again, maybe it is in some people, maybe it isn't. And what's the difference? Chiropractic still believes that if you have things out of alignment, your nervous system is not performing its task or its functions optimally. Therefore, disease progresses. It's kind of the basis of chiropractic.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think it's always the case. I think, particularly in my field, you've got to be careful to fall into that, because that can lead to the idea that everything is that. When it comes to posture is just position of bones, either forward, back, sideways, more as groups rather than singular,
Okay.
And those postural abnormalities or changes, again, not always a bad thing, I don't think, even though they don't look so good sometimes. And is it better with it or without it? Some people, you correct their posture and they feel worse. So I think in those cases, it may not be appropriate.
Yeah. What comes to mind is quite a few things, but I'll start with like a recessed jaw seems to have pretty severe implications when it comes to mouth breathing. And it also seems to be quite an unnatural thing, clearly shown by Weston Price.
Mm. Mm.
Like when you're living, different use of the term, in alignment with nature, it seems as though you don't have this structural issue.
I think, yeah. Is that rectifiable at this point? It could just be we can't change it. It's passed on.
I think my point here is that chiropractic acts a lot like a parasite cleanse. And I don't think that it's in alignment with natural principles. I think my point of view is that movement is a missing link. We talk about circulation, inflammation, hydration, structural, conduction. I think all of these can come from moving our bodies more. And I think that's natural. I think if you go to a chiropractor and you get an adjustment and you feel better, but you need one next week or in 2 weeks, it's the same thing as just needing another parasite cleanse or needing, versus if you start shifting your movement habits, you walk more, you maybe sit in chairs less. You start adapting to that environment, to maybe a more natural environment, and then things seem to adapt properly and you might regain that structure. I think that would be my perspective, is you should not force structure, but rather allow your body to adapt to the right environment.
Absolutely. But the hard thing for people is that a lot of these things will take time. And,
That's true.
Once you're in doing the right things like that, not sitting in chairs as much, squatting, not sitting, kneeling and doing all sorts of different movements that people generally avoid, they'll find that they can't, it's like not wearing shoes. They generally will not like the feeling for the first while, and then eventually they adapt back to possibly their original state. So we need to see more of this with people. They need to start doing more things that essentially aren't sedentary, but also things that they avoid that may actually be natural functional movement. Not all things are appropriate. There's some definitely things out there that people should avoid that are really awkward movements that aren't necessarily natural. But by and large, people need to move in a way that is regular and most of the day, actually. So we, as human beings, that's mostly what we did. We were constantly moving, and I think that's definitely missing now.
Yeah. So, Emrys, what do we want to leave the listener with? What are the things we can do to help our nervous system, help our vagus nerve? What are the things we can do at home?
Well, I think I talked about eating. I do think you need to regularly consume food. I don't think particularly fasting is good for the vagus nerve, and that's my opinion. I've definitely noticed that a lot of people's necks are involved with their vagus nerve. So a lot of people are constantly with their head forward like this, and they almost never look up at the sky. So they need to incorporate more neck movements, within reason. Don't do stupid things. And that's very good for the vagus nerve, and incorporate more movements through the whole spine, and their whole nervous system will work better. That's a really good starting point. And when, it's hard to give one thing that's going to help everyone, but I think that's a good little thing to add to your regime of things, to start moving your whole body, articulating your whole spine, and use your whole body throughout the whole day rather than just at one point of the day. Or walk's a great starting point, but try not to sit all day.
I love
Definitely.
that.
Yeah.
Very simple. Very simple. Emrys, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
No worries. Thank you.
Wonderful.
All right, and I want to thank you all so much for listening. Before we wrap it up, we all need to remember that this is for informational purposes only, and this does not constitute medical or therapeutic advice and will not replace the advice from a qualified practitioner. But also remember this, that we are sovereign beings capable of thinking, criticizing, and understanding absolutely anything. We are self-healers, self-teachers, self-governable, and so much more. And together with each other and the greater forces, we can regain our natural vitality, meaning, clarity, purpose, and health. I do really appreciate you all for taking the time to listen to the podcast today. If you want to support what we do, make sure to like, share, comment, subscribe, leave a rating or a review, and follow the show. Sharing is the extra step. Let a few people know about the podcast. And if you do want to go deeper and you do want to deeply support what we do here at Beyond Train, join the Beyond Train Academy. There is a ton of value in there available for you all. There is free resources as well, so do not miss out on those. If you have any questions, criticisms, comments, concerns, please reach out to me. Instagram is a great way to do that. Email works as well. But just remember, there are two types of people in the world: those who believe they can, those who believe they can't, and they are both correct. Thank you all for listening. Take care.